And the name of the book is Flight of the Eagle. It's published by Encounter. The author, Conrad Black, who joins us now from Toronto. Mr. Black, what were you trying to do with this book, this history of the United States?
Peter, I was trying to present the perspective, the historical perspective of the important decisions American statesmen have made at each stage in the progress of the country from colonial status to a position of unparalleled preeminence in the history of the nation state and in the whole world in a period of less than 200 years. And of course, there's a very extensive and often extremely scholarly and rigorous and well-written literature on the history of the United States, the entire history and every aspect of its history. This makes no pretense to being a complete history of the country, but I am not aware of, and Henry Kissinger confirmed this in his introductory note, any previous attempt to put in sequence the particularly important decisions that key American statesmen have made at each stage in that progress. I think it is often surmised that the United States just grew and became more and more important because it had the English language and the democratic tradition and the ability to populate half of a very rich continent and attract very motivated immigrants from all over the world, and it just grew like something planted in your garden. And of course there's that aspect to it. But that same thing essentially could be said about other countries that have been less successful, such as Brazil or Argentina. The difference has been in the statesmen who designed the institutions of government and directed the country at its most critical phases in that development.
Who, when it comes to the Founding Fathers, who was one of your heroes?
Well, I, in this sense, I don't think I'm particularly innovative, other than perhaps the reason they're heroes. I think the principal figures were George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, and they, of course, are legendary figures, and they don't need me to buff up the esteem in which they're universally held. But I don't think it's particularly widely known that George Washington was, in fact, a very brilliant guerrilla war leader. And that's essentially what he conducted. He kept that army going, virtually unpaid, with continuous calls for new recruits and rotating the personnel for 7 years. And he had to move it around, and he had to move inland to make it more difficult for the British to get at him, and to move around with the British chasing him. And only occasionally, in the early phases of the war, in the famous crossing of the Delaware and the attack towards Princeton and beyond, and at the end of the active part of the war at Yorktown, did he come out and stage a successful action that really turned events, although he came very close on a few other occasions, such as at Brandywine and Germantown. But he was essentially a guerrilla war leader while maintaining the dignity of a career officer, and he was a very highly regarded officer in the British Army prior to the Revolutionary War. In the case of Benjamin Franklin, of course, he was a renowned academic and inventor, scientist, printer, and a wit, a personality. But he was surely one of the greatest diplomats in the history of the world, and his achievement in assisting persuading the British to evict the French from Canada, which made the revolution possible, and then only less than 20 years later, recruiting the French, where no parliament or anything like a parliament had met for 170 years, an absolute monarchy, to come into a war in favor of republicanism and secessionism and democracy was an astounding achievement. And without the French, it would have been very difficult. The Americans would have won eventually, but they might not have won the independence of all 13 colonies, and it would have taken much longer. Yorktown was mainly a French battle.
Well, Conrad Black, early in Flight of the Eagle, 700-page book, you talk about the 7 Years' War, and you also detail I would say, George Washington's failures as a military leader and his aggressiveness, correct?
Well, he made a few mistakes, but he did win after all, and he was, we don't know what he would be like commanding large units like later American military figures like General Lee or Grant or Sherman or Eisenhower or MacArthur. We don't know how he would have done with that, but with what he had, he did very well, but he certainly was not infallible. He wasn't a Napoleon or something who almost never made a mistake.
Why do you open the book with a 7 years war?
As a military commander, he made some because it was essential to remove France from Canada for the United States as it became to have the opportunity to achieve its independence. And a few people, led by Franklin, recognized the possibilities for America to become a great country. Just let me put it in different words from what I said a moment ago. The American achievement, people of 2.5 million free people and 500,000 slaves, for them, in effect, to get the British to evict the French from their borders, and then the French to help them evict the British, to manipulate the two greatest powers in the world, was an astonishing achievement, and it wouldn't have been possible without the results in this continent of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian Wars, as they're called in the United States. I mean, that war had a different name everywhere it was fought. It was elsewhere Silesian, Pomeranian, and Carnatic, just depending on what part of it you're talking about.
Now, Conrad Black has divided his new book.
It was the first World War. I'm sorry, I just said it was the first World War in the sense it was fought all over the world.
Now, Conrad Black has divided his book, Flight of the Eagle, into 4 sections. And the first one is about the aspirant state. And the dates on that are 1754 to 1836. What's happening during this period, Conrad Black, and what is the United States aspiring to?
Well, in the early part of the period, they aspired really just to be rid of the French, but the leading colonists saw the potential for America. For the most part, they saw the potential as working in tandem and in partnership with the British, but the relationship gradually changing. Franklin, as early as 1740, predicted that America would have a greater population than the British Isles within 100 years, and he was almost exactly right. That did occur, I believe, in the early 1840s, in the time of President Van Buren, and until relations broke down between the British and the Americans, the hope amongst these people, including Washington and Jefferson and all but a few real hotheads like Samuel Adams or Patrick Henry, was that it would be worked out, but instead of being in a subordinate status, the two jurisdictions would be virtually co-equal but sharing the same monarch. And then, of course, it evolved and relations broke down, but that was the aspiration. Then once independence was achieved, it was quite another matter to set up a system that worked. The original Articles of Confederation were not successful, and at the same time that a committee led by Thomas Jefferson was instructed by the Continental Congress to prepare a Declaration of Independence, and Franklin was instructed to try and round up some allies in Europe for the Revolutionary War that was about to begin, or had in fact begun. There was also a call for a satisfactory setup of confederation between the different colonies, and no such thing happened. What did happen was that Washington and Franklin convened the Constitutional Convention in 1787, which began as a matter of resolving a boundary boundary dispute between Virginia and Maryland, but quickly turned into a call for delegates from all of the colonies to try and devise a system to govern themselves in a federal way. And it was a remarkable success. It was a terribly difficult task, and they produced a constitution which, although in my opinion it isn't working particularly well right now, has certainly served the country immensely successfully and is very justly admired everywhere in the world. It was a tremendous achievement, especially